So I've changed the paper's title, and I apologize. This always happens, but especially this was due to the need to compression for this 12-minute presentation. So it's basically focused on psychophysics from obscure science to commercial technology. So for my dissertation work, I traced the making of flavor as an object of science, and I did ethnographic work at labs on taste and smell, flavor and fragrance companies, and a high-end restaurant in the United States and in Spain. And out of that work, I've become particularly interested in the intersections and interactions between science and industry, noting especially how important this relationship has been for the development of chemosensory research in knowledge production centers such as the US, Western Europe, and Japan, and peripheral locations too. So in my thesis, I focus on the development of chemosensory research and flavor research in the US, and this is what I will be presenting, but I soon will begin a project on the development of the chemistry of fruit aromas in Colombia as a postdoctoral researcher at Universidad Nacional de Colombia, which I'm quite excited about. So today on the topic of expertise and measurement, I want to present a brief history of psychophysics, a discipline set out to measure sensation that has come in and out of fashion, so to speak, in different points in the history of the science of perception, and has witnessed a revival and relevance thanks to this application in industrial settings. Wait. So, of course, we usually, and I'm gonna go very quickly through this, we usually take flavor for granted as a quality of edible things, but hardly think of it as an object of science and technology, unless you are one of the presenters of this conference or part of the audience or belong to the industry or the small circle of chemosensory researchers. So as an object of knowledge and technological intervention, flavor has remained somewhat invisible, locked behind the industrial doors that house the very first attempts to capture aroma and make flavor into a commercial product. So yesterday, Ingemar showed us why flavor is a complicated object of science. It's elusive, it's subjective. We have to put stuff in our mouths for it to be a thing. But we also need to consider some differences between concepts. So flavor and taste becomes one. And this is a difference that is often made by taste scientists, right? So taste is a sensory modality that is accessible to all human beings and other animals. And it registers the taste of sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and umami. And likewise, flavor as an object of science usually discounts matter of taste with a capital T, right? A social category with a convoluted history that speaks of an inclination towards refinement and distinction. So flavor on the one hand is a multisensory experience created by our brain from all the sensory stimuli it receives while we eat it. Precisely how much of it and to what degree is multisensory is a matter of debate. But however, as Ingemar told us, few scientists study flavor as a multisensory single perception, and many instead focus on distinct components that admit controlled experimentation and measurement. So taste being one of them. And on top of this distinction, we have, of course, flavor as an object of technology. That is flavor as a chemical composition, the makeup of foods and the chemical composition of aromas. And flavor science has been occupied by this a lot, but I won't be discussing this here. And on the other side, again, we have flavor as an elusive object for science that is this multisensory experience. So I'm gonna focus my talk on the measurement of sensation, how a stimuli is registered. And I want to stress the point that the science of taste and smell, two of the main components of the experience of flavor, cannot be thought without reference to the industry and the commercial concerns that have promoted and facilitated its development. So at the center of the enterprise of measuring the percept and the stimuli responsible for it, we find the work of psychophysics that it's later related to fields like sensory science and marketing research, which I and Ingerman have already discussed. Um, and it's defined basically as the scientific study of the relationship between the intensity of a stimulus and its perceived magnitude. So with this definition, psychophysics might sound like an obscure science with restricted concerns, right? Just limited to quantitative characteristics of the stimulus sensations relation, but its history is actually quite fundamental for the development of taste and smell research and its application in flavor science. So psychophysics, it's considered to be an early ancestor of experimental psychology when it splits from philosophy. And it gained attention in the second half of the 19th century with the publication of Gustav um, Fechner's Elements of Psychophysics. And this was at a time when, of course, demonstrating this universal relationship between body and mind, or matter and mind, or the material and the spiritual, outer and inner experience, um, was very much a concern. And psychophysics thought, that one could study this relationship on them and demonstrate an universal relationship between these two realms through the study of the relationship between stimulus and perception. So the problem for psychophysics was not necessarily how to communicate private experience. This was a later concern, but how to measure it, right? How to give a number that could represent the feeling of hearing a louder sound, or entering into a brighter room, or eating a sweeter apple. So Fechner here, and that's one of the groundbreaking things of psychophysics, established this law that as the stimulus intensity increased, it takes greater and greater changes to change the sensation magnitude by some constant amount. And he thought this was like a logarithmic relationship. And this is very important because it didn't matter if you apply the stimulus to the eye, ear, skin, nose, or tongue. The fact that it appears that there's a lawful relationship between perception and the stimulus intensity provided a lot of hope for the measurement of sensation and its amenability to experimental manipulation. So over a century, Fechner's equation was accepted as the paradigmatic measure in psychology, but later in the 20th century, and there's like this new psychophysics as labeled by Stanley Stevens in the 1960s, that of course did not question the idea that one could measure sensation, but it did conceive it in different terms. So for Stevens, it was valid that the human subject could assign numbers to reflect the perceived intensity of stimuli. So this meant that scientists could now conveniently just ask somebody to rate on a sensation on a scale. And I guess you have seen these scales where you are asked to rate a sensation. And this, of course, became very suitable for market and consumer research, right? So instead of abstract units, such as Weber and Fechner, just noticeable differences units, reports about perception could be done through direct means. And this procedure or method did not rule out the possibility of a law. Actually, Stevens, instead of saying this, the relationship between stimuli and its perceived intensity is not logarithmic, but it's a power relation. So it's still lawful. It still responds to some law. The story, however, is not about one paradigm completely overcoming another. For over a half a century, classical psychophysics flourished alongside, one practice that then later became to be seen as non-scientific, and that is introspection, right? The practice of training subjects to carefully observe and describe their mental states and sensations. With training, it was possible to obtain experimental, relevant, and truthful data. That's what the classic psychophysicists thought. And then later, we're gonna see that trained subjects, and I think we have seen it in other presentations, are still very much used in the industry, and particularly in the food industry. However, with the rise of animal psychology, and I'm doing a big sweep here of the history, in the 20th century, the study of sensation received, of course, a more behaviorist approach. So there was a lot of fear that the language of introspection was just too imprecise, too unreliable, too cumbersome to deal with in an experimental manner. So things like discrimination tasks, right? For instance, choosing between two samples or indicating which sample is sweeter became popular. So, however, psychophysical measures of experience always need, some way or another to confront subjective perceptions. So modern psychophysicists picked a very clever route and turned the subject, into a measuring instrument for estimating the magnitudes of sensations and less for learning about private experience. So it's not an introspection as the classicists, but still people are reliable and their judgments are reliable. So after Stevens, the ability of untrained individuals, so average consumer, let's think, to act as true measuring instruments was not only recognized and accepted, but also increasingly promoted. So in all of this history of psychophysics, actually, there was little attention given to the chemical senses and their corresponding stimulus objects, partly, of course, because they were assigned a lesser role in human cognition, but also because of their measurement presented bigger challenges. So let's consider in vision, we have wavelength that translates into color. In audition, we have frequency that translates into pitch. But for taste and smell, there are not such clear units. So people have used concentration as a way of measuring, but that one it's very tricky. It has a lot of difficulties. So for instance, think about smell, how to distribute an odor, the role of fatigue, that we adapt to smells. So it becomes very, very messy. Um, so for these reasons, and with all of these difficulties, the measures of greater appeal to taste and smell psychophysicists are those based on performance, right? As I told you. And these are what are called also thresholds, because they appear to be less subjective than other measures that are based on self-report. And for this reason, they're considered that they sidestep language and avoid complicated semantics and judgments that scientists don't want to deal with.
2 minutes.
Already? Wow. Okay. And then we have these other measures, supra thresholds that came with the new psychophysics, where direct scaling procedures are usually useful for commercially oriented practice. And here is where, again, people as measurement instruments come in. We have this quote from Rosemary Packborn, a sensory scientist, telling us, flavor and odor, being sensory phenomenon by definition, cannot be measured by any non-human instrument. And that has make that things like sensory panels, flavor profiles, sensory descriptive analysis, consumer preference test have been developed in the industry as important measurement methods. And we have this because in the 1960s, there's growing interest in measuring how people respond to products, right? So not what there is in the product, but how people respond to them. So industry, of course, became a hotbed for basic and applied chemosensory research based on psychophysics, opening scientific and business opportunities simultaneously. Actually, in the 60s, the fundamental work that is done in taste and smell psychophysics is done at the Behavioral Science Division of the Army's Food Research Program. And from then on, the connection between psychophysics in academic setting of the university and research carried out in the industry starts to become more and more aligned, right? So just for some conclusions, what started as a concern for relating and measuring the psychochemical properties of foods with sensory responses then morph into a concern about maximizing computer acceptance. And that has shaped also the way psychophysics has developed. The methods that have been developed as a result have had an immense effect on the way food products are promoted and their flavors measured and described, as I showed us in her presentation. Psychophysics, and this is important, has not remained a fixed set of approaches and laws for the measurement of sensation. Actually, when I was at Monell in the Chemical Senses Center, a lot of the people there complained that, of course, one scientist that devotes himself to just doing psychophysics cannot make a career in science, because it's not considered still scientific enough. Oh. And then the last thing is that the connection of psychophysics with sensory science and marketing research shifts signals a shift, in the understanding of flavor as an object of commerce that responds to scientific and technical developments, as well as to the commercial recognitions that consumers' opinions are the determining factor of product success, and thus useful measurement instruments. Thank you.